For Chapter 6. Mr. Swamper, I have a question, said Jenny as the three walked the streets of Old Tombstone. What is it, Jenny? Replied the Swamper. If Curly Bill was an outlaw, how come he and Deputy Sheriff Billy Breckenridge were such good friends? The Swamper stopped. Well, that may take a little explaining. He motioned to a nearby bench. Let's take a seat and I'll explain it. Luke and Jenny sat down on either side of the Swamper. You see, it all goes back to the Civil War. Remember me saying something about that earlier to you? Luke and Jenny both nodded. Of all the wars that have been fought since our country began, the Civil War had to be the worst. It was a war in which Americans fought other Americans, and it was all fought on American soil. But it wasn't just the soldiers fighting each other in the battlefields that made it so bad. It was the fact that the soldiers hurt civilians too, even women and children and old people. The Swamper paused for a moment to take a deep breath before he continued. Sometimes soldiers would murder a person right in front of his or her family. They would take people's most prized possessions away and then burn down their home. Soldiers on both sides were guilty of these kinds of wrongdoings. It was a horrible, horrible war. Of course, no one in your time lived through the Civil War, and to you two, it's just something you read about in your history books. But in the 1880s, most folks either lived through these things themselves or they've heard horror stories from the war from their parents or grandparents. It's a bitter memory, not the sort of thing folks get over very easily. I see, said Jenny. The Swamper went on. Remember I told you that most of the cowboys came to Arizona from Texas? You know that Texas was a Confederate state. Most of the cowboys are Democrats, too. Well, Johnny Behan was appointed sheriff in 1881 when Cochise County was created. He was a Southerner and a Democrat, too, so naturally Curly Bill and the cowboys approved of him. Aha, said Jenny. So you're saying it's all about politics, right? The Swamper laughed and looked at Luke. That's one smart sister you have there, Luke. He looked toward two men who were standing a few feet away. There's Wyatt and Virgil Earp. Let's go over and find out what they're up to. The three walked over to the Earp brothers. As they got near, they overheard Virgil speaking to his brother. Wyatt, that horse of yours, Dick Naylor, needs some exercise. I'd like to take him out for a ride. But you know he's my favorite racehorse, Virgil, said Wyatt, and I don't let just anyone ride him. Well, I'm not just anyone, Wyatt. I'm your older brother, and I need to go check on one of our claims out near Charleston. It's only a few miles away, and I promise I'll take good care of him. Wyatt thought it over for a minute. All right, Virgil, he said, just this once, but you be careful with him. I will, Wyatt, replied his brother. Virgil stepped off the boardwalk and mounted a big, beautiful horse tied to a nearby hitching post. As they watched him ride away, Jenny said, Now, why do I get the feeling that something is going to happen to Virgil on that ride? You catch on quickly, Jenny. Today's the day Wyatt Earp becomes a legend. Would you like to see how it happens? Asked the Swamper. Sure, replied Luke. In an instant, he and his sister were standing in the desert outside of town. They saw Virgil riding the horse a few feet away from them when a man driving a buckboard wagon raced toward them, drew up to Virgil, and came to a screeching halt. Not waiting for the dust to settle, the panicked driver started shouting, Virgil, you got to help me. Well, Constable McKelvey, what brings you out here? Is there trouble in Charleston? And who is this with you? Asked Virgil. The Swamper quickly explained that Charleston was another little mining town a few miles down the road from Tombstone. They then saw a handcuffed young man in the back of the buckboard wagon who looked very scared. A lynch mob is after my prisoner, exclaimed Constable McKelvey. Sure enough, they could see a group of men on horses coming their way. Lynching means a hanging, explained the Swamper, and it's doubly bad because it happens without a trial. Here, I'll take him with me, said Virgil Earp to Constable McKelvey. The constable put his prisoner on the horse behind Virgil, who then spurred him forward and raced back to Tombstone. Let's go, said the Swamper. In a blink, they were back on the boardwalk in front of the Wells Fargo office in Tombstone, just in time to see Virgil come racing in with Constable McKelvey's prisoner. Wyatt came running out of the Wells Fargo office. What's going on here, Virgil? That man's nothing but a two-bit gambler who calls himself Johnny Behind the Deuce. What kind of trouble has he gotten into this time? Killed a man in Charleston, said Johnny Behind the Deuce as Virgil Earp dismounted. It was self-defense, honest. But now a mob is after me and they're going to hang me. While Virgil helped Johnny Behind the Deuce off the horse, Wyatt stepped back into the Wells Fargo office. A moment later, he returned with a shotgun in his hand. Come with me, he said, as he led Virgil and Johnny across the street to Vogan's bowling alley and saloon. The Swamper motioned to Luke and Jenny to follow the Earps into the building. They had barely stepped inside when Jenny turned to look behind her. "Uh-oh," she exclaimed. Luke and the swamper turned around. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing out the door. "A big mob is forming, and they all have guns." Luke and the swamper saw a large group of armed men surrounding the door to the bowling alley. Then they heard Wyatt Earp behind them calling out, "Virgil! Morgan! Doc Holliday, can you come over here?" They watched Wyatt motion to a few other men to come and help too. He got all the men to surround Johnny behind the deuce. Then Wyatt, still holding his shotgun, told his friends to come with him and take Johnny out onto Allen Street. As they came onto the boardwalk, Wyatt addressed the crowd. "Stand back," he ordered them. "I'm taking this prisoner to jail in Tucson so he can have a fair trial. If he's proven guilty, the law will deal with him. It's not up to any of you to judge him before all the evidence is heard." Wyatt and his friends tried to escort Johnny behind the deuce to a nearby livery stable. Luke, Jenny, and the swamper walked along with them, but they didn't get very far before the mob blocked their way. Wyatt recognized one of the men in the mob. "That's Dick Gerd," explained the swamper, reminding them that Dick Gerd was the engineer who came with the Shefflin brothers to start up the mines. "He's well respected in town. If Wyatt can convince him to back off, the rest of them will too." Wyatt Earp looked directly at Dick Gerd and said in a loud voice, "If anything should happen to my prisoner, Dick Gerd will die." Dick Gerd was shocked. He swallowed hard as the color quickly drained from his face. He immediately stepped back as far as he could. Others in the crowd followed, stepping aside, making way for Wyatt to take his prisoner to the livery stable. "That was scary," said Jenny as they watched Wyatt take his prisoner away. "The men in that crowd were armed and they could have easily killed Wyatt," explained the swamper, "yet he risked his own life to save a no-account gambler." "Why would he do something like that?" asked Luke. "I know why," replied Jenny, "because you're innocent until proven guilty in a court of law and everyone's entitled to a fair trial." She paused for a moment and then added, "I learned that last year in my social studies class, but I didn't really understand what it meant until now." "Then I guess this means Wyatt Earp is a hero," said Luke. "For now, Luke," said the swamper, "but soon things will happen that will tarnish Wyatt Earp's reputation for the remainder of his life and beyond. Even in your time, people disagree. Some people think he was a good lawman, even a hero, while others believe he was a cold-blooded murderer." "A murderer?" asked Luke. "Who did he kill? How did that happen?" "Well, it's a very long story. You see, Wyatt's troubles all began with a stagecoach," said the swamper.